So this is 100% by design. It's something that, we've called it over time weaponized migration, because it's using migration as a weapon of warfare, of asymmetric warfare. And I believe Venezuela has been the platform to do that. They've catalyzed the Central American migration. They catalyzed the Haitian migration. They built the bridge through the Darien Gap. They've implemented transnational organized crime, and they work with the Mexican cartels. So China, Russia, and Iran could sit back and kind of maneuver the situation, because have plausible deniability. But in reality, they're using Venezuela as an asymmetric weapon to attack the United States.
Non-governmental organizations not knowing or knowingly assisting cartels. What is going on here? What is behind this? What is behind the number of groups that we're seeing, also the United Nations, and the exorbitant amount of aid being distributed throughout Central America to migration issues? By the way, what is it with our own Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, also distributing hundreds of millions of dollars to handle the migration crisis that appears to be happening because the Biden administration has basically dissolved our sovereignty and opened our borders? And what about our adversaries, and how do they play into this? These groups receive millions of your taxpayer dollars. And I'm talking the non-governmental organizations, and I'm talking the UN, and I'm talking about our small cities in the United States and towns that are dealing with migration, receiving millions of your hard-earned dollars each year, giving that money to these groups so that they can buy phones for illegal migrants, illegal aliens, however you want to call it, food, credit cards, plane tickets, and so much more. But how are the people coming here? Who or what is behind it? Could they possibly be coming in because our adversaries are making it possible, and then our administration knowingly is allowing it to happen? Could some of the NGOs be working with other shadow groups that have ulterior motives as to why they want to get these people into the United States? How are the cartels connected? We're going to expose all of that on today's show with my friend Joseph Humire. He is an expert in this area of migration. He has traveled the world and continues to travel the world. And he is somebody that I go to when I have questions of this magnitude and this importance. And by the way, folks, this is probably one of the most important crisis issues of our time. It could literally be the downfall of our nation. And if you don't believe me, you need to listen to Joseph Humire, because he will change your mind. You are going to love this conversation, or maybe not love it, but you're going to want to hear it. But first, HelloFresh. I love HelloFresh. You know that. They are a sponsor of the Sara Carter Show, and they make it possible for me to bring great guests like Joseph Humire, Ambassador Rick Grinnell, and so many other important people in our world today to you, directly to you. And you know what else I want to bring directly to you? HelloFresh. I want to bring you food so that you can go home and not have to worry about what you're going to cook for dinner. Because let me tell you, that happens to me a lot. I travel a lot, I work a lot, and I want things to be simple. And I do that with HelloFresh. I love it. You'll love the taste of all the freshness in every single bite. And right now, HelloFresh has chef-crafted recipes. It's amazing. Produce travels from the farm to your door for peak ripeness that you can taste. And you can feast on desserts, folks, like apple cider cake and with caramel sauce. You can please the crowd with barbecue pulled pork nachos. And don't forget the mini pumpkin cheesecake, perfect for a me time treat, right? And I tell you, this is probably one of the best things I have coming to my home right now, especially when it comes to food. I can go to the grocery store, I get milk, I get bread, I get, the basics. But when it comes to making a meal now, I just come home from a trip. If I'm at the border, I come home and the HelloFresh is right there. It's all in these amazing little bags. It's got all the fresh produce in it, and it's so easy for me to make. And by the way, it's not the same old. So it excites my family. My family's like, oh, this is a new dish. I think that's the best part of it, is like, I'm not making the same thing over and over again. So go to HelloFresh.com/50 Sara Carter and use code 50 Sara Carter for, guess what? 50% off plus free shipping. Again, save 50% off plus free shipping at HelloFresh.com/50 Sarah Carter and use code 50 Sarah Carter. HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. I'm so happy I have Joseph Humire here on the show. He is a friend. He is also the executive director of the Center for a Secure Free Society and visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation. And I've been working with Heritage, Joseph, since I was a young reporter and I came to Washington, D.C. to work at the Washington Times. Your podcast, Border Wars, is explosive. And folks out there, if you are not listening to it, you should be. I'm so grateful to have you on the show because there is nobody better, Joseph, than you at explaining what is happening in the Western Hemisphere, particularly with our border in South America as well as Central America, and how devastating this could be to our nation. Thank you so much for being here today.
Absolutely, Sarah. It's a privilege and honor. Thank you for all the work that you do. I follow your work quite a bit on everything that you're doing from the border to Latin America, to China, to terrorism. I know you were in Israel not too long ago, and what's going on in Israel is very concerning. And so thank you for everything that you do. And Heritage, it's interesting because in the think tank world, Heritage has always been like a big brother to all of us. And so I joined Heritage this year as a visiting fellow. And to me, it was like kind of coming home because the think tank that I run, Center for Secure Free Society, we started at Heritage. So it's like a 180-degree full circle. And so it's a privilege to be with Heritage as well. Oh,
that's wonderful. I didn't realize that. So you started there, you broke off on your own, which I think is, the incredible work that you're doing and the amount of travel, Joseph, is incredible. I just kind of want to do the lay of the land so people understand. I mean, you basically travel the world. You're not somebody who just reads the books and pretends like you know what you're talking about. You actually meet world leaders. You travel throughout Central America, South America, Europe, Asia. I mean, every time I try to find you, you're in another country or I'm in another country. I don't know, but you really beat me. You really beat me on those sky miles.
Well, yeah, I think also kind of like that's to the detriment of my health sometimes because sometimes I'm pushing a little too hard. No, I mean, I'm a firm believer and you have to kind of go and see it for yourself. There's a lot you can do in terms of reading and analyzing and discussing here in Washington. A lot of people come to Washington, but there's an energy that you get, and you know this, Sarah, you do a lot of field work. There's an energy you get when you visit a country, like your senses kind of change. You get a sense of not just the environment that you're in, but you also get a sense of the level of risk and danger and as you travel countries repeatedly, you start to see how that country's kind of transforming. So Latin America, I go to, every month. I'm pretty much in some country in Latin America. But as you mentioned, I go to other parts of the world. I spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I was in the military before, so I spent some time in the Middle East. And that's obviously a region that's very, very troubled, difficult. Lately going more to Asia because of China. I just came back from Japan. And this is the big so what. This is the why. Because I feel a lot of people that have done Latin America work over time, colleagues, friends of mine, but they failed to explain why Latin America is important in terms of geopolitics, right? It was an inward-looking perspective on the region, like the political dynamics, drug trafficking, organized crime, trade, however you want to look at it. But it was very inward-looking and never talked about where Latin America is situated in global geopolitics. But it wasn't very far you had to look, because if you paid attention to what was going on in Latin America, all of the U.S. adversaries, all of our, as they say here in Washington, near-peer competitors, were all very much active in the region, in China, Russia, Iran. And so that's kind of what piqued my interest. And so I go to these other regions to learn more about how Iran, Russia, and China operate in their near abroad, so I could bring that wisdom to Washington and also bring it to Latin America, because I feel like they need to educate themselves. Because as opposed to the First and the Second World War, I think is on a precipice of another world war, that war is going to take place, part of it, in the Latin America theater of operation. I think the Latin Americans need to be ready for that. I absolutely agree with you. And I think our failure, and I've talked to you about this in the past, and I'm talking about U.S. failure, foreign policy failure, our failure in the Western Hemisphere, is not to make that a priority in these administrations that we've seen in the past. I know for the first time, I think I saw the Trump administration prioritize what was happening in Latin America. I give him that. President Trump was very focused on what was happening in the region, mainly because of what we have seen at the border, this explosive
amount of migration, weaponized migration. You and I have also discussed that coming into the United States. One of the most interesting pieces that you've recently written, and it was in August, was how Iran's weapons now reach the Western Hemisphere. And you talked about, Bolivia being Iran's the most successful, is your first point in the key takeaway for Heritage Foundation foreign policy project in Latin America. Prior to 2007, Iran had no diplomatic presence in Bolivia. But you also talk about the decades-old Venezuelan-Bolivian military cooperation, and is what it underpins Iran's advancements. And we've seen what's happened in Israel. And yes, I was there recently. And we've seen what Hamas has been capable of because of Iran. And we know that we have a direct threat in our own Western Hemisphere, but no one's paying attention. Can you, and we'll get into the NGOs in a minute, but can you explain that threat as if you were briefing a president on this issue, so that every listener, so you can hear directly from one of the world's leading experts why we need to pay attention to the border and why we need to pay attention to the Western Hemisphere?
Okay, well, there's a lot there, Sarah, so I'm going to try to unpack this as best I could, as if I was speaking to a president, because I think, first, let me start with this, because you mentioned this. To me, it's crazy that the United States doesn't have a high priority on the area in which we live. I mean, we have strategies for every region in the world except the neighborhood in which we live in, which to me is kind of mind-boggling, right? I go to all these meetings, think tank meetings here in Washington, and every region comes up, Indo-Pacific, Africa, Middle East, Europe, except Latin America. And I'm like, do you imagine China having a global strategy and not prioritizing Asia and the Pacific Islands, or Russia not prioritizing Central Eastern Europe, or Iran not? It makes no sense. So that's first. I agree with you 100%. This has been the #1 foreign policy failure of the United States over decades, and that's coming home to roost. And the border is part of that. The border is part of our failure on U.S. foreign policy. Okay, second to the point on Venezuela, and you're right, Sarah. I think the Trump administration had an attitude for one, engaging Latin America, in which they did, but also in trying to solve the most complex and hardest challenge in Latin America, which is the Venezuela crisis. Largest humanitarian crisis in the history of Latin America. We're talking about poverty and famine rates that are equitable to like Haiti and Africa. The largest migration in the world. It wasn't when it was the Trump administration, it was the second next to Syria. It's now the largest. It surpassed Syria and has actually surpassed Ukraine, 2 war zones. 7.7 million Venezuelans have fled that country since 2014. The reason we didn't hear about it as much in the United States was because most of that time, after 2014 to about 2020, they mostly fled south. So all of South America was inundated with Venezuelans. If you go to any country in South America, all you heard about was we have too many Venezuelan migrants here. That started pushing north after 2020. We could get into that a little bit more. But now we're seeing it because we don't get to those numbers of 2.7 million encounters and apprehensions on the U.S. southern border without the Venezuelan mass migration connecting north. Because before it was Central Americans, then it was Haitians, Caribbean, Cubans. But once the Venezuela, that's a big country. Once that starts to push north, it kind of pretty much topples our border. So that brings the question. This is what I'm going to focus on right now. What is Venezuela? Because I think that's what your audience needs to understand. And this is a complex thing. I think elements of the U.S. government tried to understand that, but they weren't prepared. They didn't have their best analysts understanding what the complexity of the Venezuela crisis. Because the simple definition of the Venezuela crisis was that it's basically a socialist disaster, meaning Hugo Chavez created a bunch of failed socialist policies that destroyed the country's economy. What was once one of the richest countries in the region now became one of the poorest, which was once a major oil producer with the largest oil reserves in the world, now has struggles to even basically produce hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil per day. Combined with a narco state, combined with a regime that was heavily embedded in narco trafficking. So that was the way it was described. That was, and with Cuban occupation, the Cubans were managing the situation. So It was Cuban occupation, narco trafficking, and socialism. That was the general conventional wisdom on Venezuela. That is partially correct. But that's not the whole story, because if that was Venezuela, we would have solved that under the maximum pressure campaign of President Trump. We've had socialist countries in Latin America. There's plenty of them in the region. Cuban-occupied countries. We could look at Grenada. That was a Cuban-occupied country that we actually invaded to basically push out the Cuban occupation. Narco states, Panama, Manuel Noriega. We had narco states, but we never seen anything like this. And this is what I'm going to say, and I think I'll start with this. The one data point that helps kind of illuminate how complex Venezuela is the fact that there's today more Venezuelans in Syria than there is in Brazil. There's 350,000 Venezuelans that live in Syria and only about 280,000 that live in Brazil, which is right next door. Why is that, right? Why are there so? Because
my mind is so blown right now. I didn't even understand. I didn't even conceptualize that. I didn't even expect you to go there.
No, that's 100%. I mean, there's a section of southwest Syria, which is near the border of Israel, on the border of Jordan, which is called Asawaida. And Asawaida, that's where Hezbollah operates. That's where the Russians are positioned. They're the ones that protected Bashar al-Assad during his dictatorship. And if you go to Asawaida, they call it the Little Venezuela because they eat arepas, they dance salsa, they speak Spanish and Arabic, and they're dual nationals. But why does this exist? We went there. My researchers went to Asawaida. That's how we got to get a sense of this. But why does Asawaida exist? Why are there so many Venezuelans in Syria?
Why?
Because Venezuela is not a conflict that originated in Latin America. It's not just the Cubans. Venezuela is a conflict that was exported from the Middle East. And that point, 10 years ago, sounded crazy to a lot of the analytical intelligence community in the United States. Today, they're starting to realize why that is, because we're seeing levels of conflict in Latin America that we've never seen in the region, and we've only seen in places like the Middle East. And I'll unpack that. I'll give you actually an anecdote. This is actually literally how I explained it to a president in Latin America, since we're doing it that way. I told him, I said, let me give you a story, Mr. President, on what the Venezuela crisis really is. And it'll be a short story. You'll recognize it as soon as I talk about it. It's a story about a lieutenant colonel. A lieutenant colonel that tried to capture his country by force, but failed through a failed coup d'etat, eventually got elected democratically, and then nationalized his natural resources, used his natural resources to basically spark a revolution, first in his country, then throughout this region, and all the while accused all his opponents of being imperialists and occupiers, and basically was kicking him out of his country. This lieutenant colonel turned president died after 14 years of office of natural causes, but not before leaving a legacy of crime, corruption, and conflict. I say that, and the president's like, Joseph, I know Hugo Chávez's story. And I say, you're right, Mr. President, but I'm not talking about Hugo Chávez. I'm talking about Lieutenant Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, why is Nasser's story identical to Hugo Chávez? They actually had the same exact story. Why? Because Venezuela, the origin of the crisis, was an extension of the pan-Arab nationalist movement in Egypt and Syria, in the Middle East, that dominated Middle Eastern politics during the oil boom of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. That's where this begins. That's where the story of Venezuela begins. And I'll give you another story, because in 1964, when after the Cubans took over the island, they immediately went to Venezuela because they knew that's where the oil was. They went to Venezuela to capture the oil, but they failed. By 1964, all the leaders of the Communist Party of Venezuela were in prison by the military, because Venezuela is a bigger country with a much more institutionalized military at the time. They couldn't do the guerrilla warfare that they did on the island in Venezuela. But by 1967, there's this famous jail breakout. It's called the San Carlos prison breakout. They broke the communists out of prison. Who broke the communists? Literally digging a tunnel from the prison across the street was a Syrian refugee. A Syrian refugee by the name of Nehemet Chagin Simon. They call him in Venezuela Simon el Árabe, because this was an intelligence operative of the Ba'athis from Syria, from Haifiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, that trained in Russia as a linguist, but he was really an intelligence operative, that went to Venezuela and basically indoctrinated Venezuela and said, listen, that guerrilla warfare stuff that the Cubans do, that's not going to work. It didn't work in Africa, it didn't work in Angola, it didn't work in Bolivia. Che Guevara's failing all around the world. What you guys need to do is not guerrilla warfare. Don't attack the military, infiltrate them. That's the difference in doctrine in terms of guerrilla warfare and insurgency. That's what Nassar did. That's what Assad did. That's what the Middle East is like. And so they trained the Venezuelans on insurgency. They trained them on infiltration, on subversion, on sabotage, which is why Venezuela was able to get to places that Cuba was never able to get to. That's not to say the Cubans aren't important. They're heavily important as managers. They manage. They're great at espionage. They're great at counterintelligence. They have networks all throughout Latin America. So they're very useful as managers. But the strategy was born in the Middle East. And that's why Iran's important. And that goes a roundabout way to answer your question.
Do you think, and my mind is it's just spinning right now. I mean, I've got all these questions for you. I always do. But it has to be that what we are seeing as far as migration coming to the United States the heavy flows of migration from Venezuela, this has to be part of an intelligence operation, a strategy on the part of the Venezuelan government, not just I decided I was going to leave and I saw an ad on Facebook. I mean, because I'm not seeing just, random families. I'm seeing 700 men, 800 military aged males, people that look like they might have come out of prison, but I'm not quite sure because I can't prove it. And people coming with no identification on them that we can't vet. What's going on here, so, Joseph?
No, think about what we just talked about, Sarah. Like the Venezuelan crisis, everything that we're seeing, the highest inflation in the world, the world's largest migration crisis, it was imported into Venezuela. It's not the Venezuelans that decided to do this. It came from the Middle East, and it came through refugees. It came through migrants. It came through asylum programs. So what are they doing to the United States? They're doing the same thing they did to Venezuela. They captured that country, they collapsed it, and now it's no longer a sovereign country. It's controlled by authoritarian powers. Russia, China, and Iran control Venezuela as a platform to attack the United States. So they're doing the same thing to the United States. Now, we're a much bigger country. We're a much stronger country. But that strength and that power is only precipitated by two things: by our unity as people and by our rule of law. So they're dismantling our rule of law. They're dismantling our social cohesion, and they're dividing us from within because, the old strategy of divide and conquer, right? China's whole strategy, and I think Iran, Russia is part of this, their whole strategy is to win the war without firing a shot. They want us to give up before we even get into the war. And they're going to create these conflicts all around the world, Ukraine, Gaza, Taiwan, and there's going to be one in Latin America. And all the time, the United States won't have the political will to engage. Different than World War II and World War I, where had we not engaged in that conflict, we'd all be speaking German right now. But that we engaged that conflict because we thought that the fight was worth fighting, and we did, and the international order was developed after that. But going back to Venezuela, no, 100%, this is nothing about what's happening on the U.S. southern border is organic. Root causes have been around in Latin America since the region was born. There's been poverty, there's been insecurity, there's been social inequality. That's not a problem that's going to be solved overnight. But we didn't have this level of migration. It's not like it got drastically different. It's been progressively same or worse in some countries. But the level of migration that we're seeing is unprecedented in the history of the region. So this is 100% by design. It's something that, we've called it over time weaponized migration because it's using migration as a weapon of warfare, of asymmetric warfare. And I believe Venezuela has been the platform to do that. They've catalyzed the Central American migration. They catalyzed the Haitian migration. They built the bridge through the Darien Gap. They've implemented transnational organized crime, and they work with the Mexican cartels. So China, Russia, and Iran could sit back and kind of maneuver the situation, because have plausible deniability. But in reality, they're using Venezuela as an asymmetric weapon to attack the United States. And the border is the first phase of that attack.
Hey, folks, Human Super Beets. I love it. It has a great taste, and you're going to love it too. And not only does it taste great, it's going to help you keep your heart healthy. It's going to help you keep your circulation going. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the antioxidants in Super Beets are clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. And you guys know how much I travel. I travel all the time. I carry my Human Super Beets. In my pocket, in my purse, in my handbag, whatever I have, I take 2 a day. I take 2 a day, and it makes me feel fantastic. Supporting healthy blood pressure comes with a bonus. Super Beets Heart Chews support healthy circulation. So you not only get blood pressure support, you also get productive, heart healthy energy without the crash. Double your potential with Super Beets Heart Chews. Get a free 30-day supply of Super Beets Heart Chews and 15% off your first order by going to getsuperbeets.com and using promo code Sara, S-A-R-A. That's getsuperbeets.com. Code Sara. If you love breaking down the border crisis and understanding what could possibly happen to our nation and its future and what you can do about it, hit that subscribe button down below, leave us a like, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. I don't care if it's Spotify, Apple, whatever your podcast. Thank you so much. It really does make a difference. Let's talk about that, because a big problem is the United Nations and the non-governmental organizations as well that are most active in moving as many people towards our border as possible. And this is something that I know you've been looking into, something that I've been looking into. talk a little bit about how these NGOs, let's start with the NGOs first, play a role in migration.
Yeah, so I first started looking at this maybe around the same time you did, Sarah, because I remember to me the migration crisis had kind of elements that started to build on each other. I think the first time that you started really hearing about was 2014 during the unaccompanied minors, and they started arriving on the border. That was all kind of weird. No one really knew what was going on. I remember the commander of Southcom at the time saying that they thought there was elements of this that was inorganic, but they really had the elements to prove that, but they were thinking it. And then 2018 to me was the real point where I started to get really interested in this topic, because the Central American caravans. I mean, I was in Guatemala when that popped up. I know you were in Guatemala too, and like, it was crazy because, you know, it went from, I remember from October 12th, 180 Hondurans crossed the Aguas Calientes border crossing between Honduras and Guatemala. And by October 20th, so 8 days later, it was over 7,000. Like, what happened? Like, what Hondurans didn't just wake up one day and be like, you know, I'm out of here. Like, I don't like the food. The weather's bad. Or like, that didn't make no sense. I don't know in any universe that says like, oh, that's just people that are fleeing persecution or fleeing insecurity or crime. Like, that didn't happen overnight. Like, those conditions have been existing in Honduras forever. So that begged the question of what actually took place there, and that goes to the NGOs. One of the things that caught my attention when I did the research, we actually published a paper on this. It's called Central American Caravans. You can find it on our website, securefreesociety.org. But what we really came to the conclusion was there was these NGOs that were established months and years prior to this incident in October 2018 that were preparing to attend to thousands of migrants. Now, why would you prepare to attend to tens of thousands of migrants if you weren't having tens of thousands of migrants that were crossing through? So it seemed like they were preparing for this kind of activity months and years in advance. And some of those NGOs were not humanitarian NGOs, like actually trying to deal with like attending to migrants, migrant care. Some of those NGOs were 100% politicized. Some of those NGOs were connected to the United Nations. Some of them were also connected to other relief organizations in the United States. I'll point to one, because this was the one that I thought the most obvious. Pueblo Sin Fronteras, right, in Honduras. This NGO is Pueblo Sin Fronteras is Spanish for people without borders, so the mission's in the name. It was created by a Honduran political actor that was tied to a political party that was tied to the former president who was best friends with Hugo Chavez. Right? There was clearly a political interest in this. This NGO, Pueblo Sin Fronteras, was not only giving money to the migrants, they were actually giving scripts so that they could know what to say when they get interviewed by international press, who were all operating in Guatemala, but they weren't looking at the supply chain of the migrants. They were looking at just the herd, the crowd. What we looked at, they moved like a military convoy. They had an advance party. About 10% of the migrants would move 48 hours ahead of the main body, working through WhatsApp and Telegram channels, giving conditions of terrain and security. But most importantly, had a rear body, and the rear body would move in vehicles. And they actually weren't even Central American. Most of them were extracontinental, African, Middle Eastern. And I remember President Trump tweeted at the time, not everybody that's crossing through this border is from Central America. We have Middle Easterners as well. And everybody ridiculed him in the international press. He was 100% right. We had a list of 189 extracontinental migrants that were moving through those caravans in October of 2019. The authorities in Guatemala had that list. The State Department had that list, but they still decided to make this diminish this threat. That to me was the beginning of this. And actually one thing on that point of the caravans, because we started to dig a little bit more, because I was like, this doesn't make any sense. This is absolutely not organic. And we came to find out because this political party that created this NGO in Honduras was very active in the region, Mel Zelaya, who's the former president of Honduras, was touring entire Latin America in the months prior to this, promoting what? Promoting migrant caravans, talking about border insecurity as a crime against humanity. And by tracking his movements, we found payments from the Venezuelan government to these political actors in Honduras to create university events to talk about migrant caravans. So the Venezuelan government was already catalyzing a lot of this Central American migration that would be used to be able to flood the U.S. border. So that brought the question in my mind is, why does the Venezuelan government care about Central American caravans and our border? And that began this journey of trying to understand Venezuela's role in the weaponization of migration. And what I came to find was, the first border that Venezuela really attacked wasn't our border, it was the Colombian border. They went right after the Colombian border. Colombia was always kind of like a antagonistic country with Venezuela, despite they have commonalities in culture and history. But they had a government at the time that was antagonistic to the Maduro regime. And so they decided to capture that country, not using the military, not using force. They captured it through migration, disinformation, and political subversion. And now Colombia is aligned with Venezuela. And they people think that was just like a normal election and it just happened. No, that happened very systematically by a regime that understands the ways and means of asymmetric war. And so I call this the sovereign border disintegration process, because there was a process of how they did it. It always begins with mass migration and humanitarian crisis. So the numbers were there, right? At the time, it was 2-3 million that were leaving Venezuela, and they were collapsing Colombia. I mean, Colombia is a smaller country, it was getting flooded with immigration. But what happens when the capacity of a government diminishes till they can't control their border, which is happening in our border, but then it was happening in the Colombian border, was you leave gaps along the border to where they become stateless. Basically, the government no longer controls that part of the border. And in the absence of the state comes the criminal actors. And so in the case of Colombia, it wasn't Mexican cartels. In the case of Colombia, it was the FARC and the ELN. They started to capture all these border towns. And what they did is they started to change the incentives. So the people in those towns no longer worked for production members of society, companies, government. They worked for the cartels. And as they worked for the cartels, they started to create infighting, control over territory. That infighting escalated the crime and violence to unprecedented levels that it deployed the Colombian military to the border. Once that happened, then the Maduro regime started using disinformation. And they started using disinformation to create narratives around peace. We need to create peace agreements to be able to solve our border issues. The Russians were actually involved in doing a lot of this disinformation. And then once you get past the disinformation, and this is the last few, I took about 6 trips to the Colombian-Venezuelan border, accompanied by the Colombian military. And the last trip that I took was on April 2022, I think. I'll tell you what I saw. I didn't care about the cartels. I didn't care about the drugs. I didn't care about the mass migration. What I saw and what I cared about was I saw Iranian drones doing low-level overflights over sovereign airspace into Colombia, doing imagery collection. I saw Russian radar systems, the P-18 mobile radar systems, traveling up and down the border, sucking up all the communications of the Colombian military. And I saw one of the biggest Chinese satellite tracking stations that they have in the Western Hemisphere. China only has 3 deep space stations in the world. 2 are in mainland China, 1's in Argentina, and the one in Argentina is connected to the one in Venezuela, which is managed by a company called CLTC, which is a PLA offshoot. So they had a PLA satellite station, Russian radars, and Iranian drones. That to me was what I call great power competition coming to your border. That's what's happening to our border. We're on the earlier stage of that. But over time, if Mexico continues to disintegrate and Venezuela continues to take over, you're going to start to see the same thing happen to our border. And we won't be able to know it's happening until it's too late.
Okay, I want to thank Joseph for coming on the show. I've had to make this a 2-part series because Joseph and I can literally talk forever. And I think what he has to say is so important. And I want to share that with you because, folks, I want you to listen to what I am saying. You and I are going to have to defend our nation. You and I are going to have to put people in office that are going to fight for us, people that aren't going to be afraid to stand up to our adversaries, both in our country and outside of our country. We absolutely must do that, or we are going to lose this precious, beautiful nation. Remember, it's up to us to keep our nation safe. Without us, this nation does not exist. You and I together need to do our best to fight for her, to love her, to give her what she needs so that she can give future generations of Americans life, liberty, and happiness. Please make sure you are subscribed to the Sara Carter Show here on your favorite podcast app. It really helps. Follow me on Truth at Sara Carter Official, on X at Sara Carter DC, and on Instagram at SCarterDC. God bless you. God bless and pray for our beautiful nation. And God bless the great state of Texas. Please, folks, pray for peace around the world.